Hello there and welcome to my guide for painting the Marvel Crisis Protocol set of Agent Venom and Spider-Woman. As you can see, to make things a lot easier for myself, I've sprayed up Agent Venom black and Spider-Woman with white. Both sprays were using the Colour Forge range. I'm going to start with Spider-Woman first, and I'm going to use some Blood Angels red contrast paint. And while that dries, I'm going to neaten up the spray for Agent Venom, and I'm just going to make sure I catch every part that I missed with this spray with some Abaddon black. Then I'm going to dry brush his suit, and only his suit, with some Corvus black. After that, I'll start working on the highlights properly, and I'm going to use some Eshin Grey for the first highlight. And for the second highlight, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Eshin Grey and Mechanicus Standard Grey. Then I'll use Mechanicus Standard Grey just by itself to paint his belt and his pouches. Then for his tendrils, I'm going to do a 70-30 mix of Abaddon black and Cantor blue. This will be followed by a highlight just on mostly the sort of bends and the ridges with a 50-50 mix of Cantor blue and Abaddon black. This will then be followed by the same mix, but at a 70-30 ratio in favour of Cantor blue. This is mostly used on sort of the peaks and the main sort of edges of the curves. Then I'm going to paint his belt buckle with some Iron Hand steel. Then I'm going to paint his guns and that iron railing with some Iron Warriors. I'll then give the belt, the iron railings, the guns and the tendrils a wash with some Nuln Oil. While that dries, we're going to move back to Spider-Woman, and we're going to use some Evil Sunz Scarlet just to neaten up all of her red. Try to avoid the recesses as well, because we want to keep that shading. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Evil Sunz Scarlet and Wild Rider Red. And then for the final highlight, we're just going to use Wild Rider Red just by itself. After that, I'll then use some Yenden Yellow contrast paint to start the yellow. And while that dried, I highlighted the guns that Agent Venom is carrying with some Stormhost Silver. I then relayered the Mechanicus Standard Grey with a little bit of Mechanicus Standard Grey, making sure I avoided all the recesses. This was followed by a 50-50 mix of Dawnstone and Mechanicus Standard Grey to do the highlights. I then used some Grey Sear for all the white markings that are on his chest, and I also used it for his eyes as well. And this was given a wash with some Nuln Oil with a little bit of Lamia Medium mixed in. While that wash dried, I moved back to Spider-Woman and used some Avalanche Sunset to neaten up all the yellow areas. Again, taking care to avoid the recesses. I then used a 70-30 mix of Avalanche Sunset and Dawn Yellow for the first highlight. I then used the same mix but at a 50-50 ratio for the second highlight. I then used Eshin Grey for the web wings between her armpits. This was followed by a 50-50 mix of Eshin Grey and Mechanicus Standard Grey. This was followed by Mechanicus Standard Grey just by itself. And this was followed by a 50-50 mix of Mechanicus Standard Grey and Dawnstone. I then used Abaddon Black to very carefully paint in all of the black areas on her suit. Before I highlighted the black, I wasn't entirely satisfied with the way her web wings look, so I used some of the Nuln Oil Lamia Medium mix just to darken things up a little bit and give it a little bit more shading. I then went ahead and used Corvus Black to highlight the black areas on her suit. I used Grey Sear to paint in her lenses. And this was followed by a highlight of matte white. I then used the matte white to highlight all the white markings on Agent Venom. Then I used the Nuln Oil mix just to quickly darken his lenses so that gives it a little bit of shading. I then used Cadian Flesh Tone on Spider-Woman's face, which was then given a wash with some Reichland Flesh Shade. Once the wash had dried, I then relayered the Cadian Flesh Tone. This was followed by a 50-50 mix of Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislev Flesh, and then a final highlight of Kislev Flesh just by itself. I also very carefully painted her lips with some Evil Sunz Scarlet to give her a bit of lipstick. Her hair was then painted with Abaddon Black, which was given a wash with some Nuln oil. While that dries, I'm going to start to work on the base. First thing I'm going to do is paint the brickwork that Spider-Woman is standing on with some Blood Reaver flesh. This will then be highlighted with a 50-50 mix of Blood Reaver flesh and Bugman's Glow. Then I'm going to do any metalwork that needs to be done on the base using some Iron Hands steel. And then all of the concrete will get a coat with Dawnstone. After all this, Spider-Woman's hair is finally dry, so I'm going to use some Corvus Black to do the first highlight, followed by a 50-50 mix of Corvus Black and Eshin Grey. Then I'm going to use some Grey Sear to edge highlight all of the Dawnstone. I'll paint the rims with some Abaddon Black. And then the whole base, including the masonry work, will get a wash with some watered down Agrax Earthshade. Once that wash is dry, they will be finished. Once again, Atomic Mass knock it out of the park with their models. I really do love Atomic Mass's stuff. They are a little bit expensive, but they do phenomenal models. As these guys didn't really have much colour to them, they only took around about 4.5 hours to paint. Agent Venom obviously being the fastest. As I said, I really enjoyed painting them, and I hope you do too, and I hope if you follow this guide you also found the guide quite useful, and I hope it really does help you. If it did, give us a like, maybe a subscribe, and then I will see you on the next one. Goodbye for now.